Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to all the KTV viewers to a special Sikh Network show. The Sikh Network show talks about key issues that were raised in the Sikh manifesto that was published by the Sikh Network for the 2015 general election, both for politicians and for our Sikh community, to in one place capture all the priority issues for the community that we would work through for the next 5 years. One of the key issues within the Sikh manifesto was the census 2021 and about having a separate Sikh ethnic tick box in the census that would then support monitoring and reporting of Sikhs going forward in the UK. This is a long-standing campaign that's been going on 2 decades, led originally by the British Sikh Federation and then picked up in 2001 by the Sikh Federation UK, and they've been campaigning since then for a separate Sikh tick box. We'll talk about that journey in terms of why it is so important to be recognised as both an ethnic group as well as a faith, but also the mechanisms behind the census and why it is causing discrimination for everyday Sikhs, and why the campaign now and its inclusion in the Sikh manifesto is being supported by a number of politicians led by the APPG for British Sikhs and MP Preet Kaur Gill and Dhanmanjit Singh Desi, but also by hundreds of Gurdwara across the UK. Recently, we've made very strong progress in this, and it's been covered by the mainstream newspapers in the UK. The Times, along with many others, have picked up on the story. And that's caused certain very small minorities in the community to start to cause and ask questions, and largely disillusion many of the Sikh community around some of the pitfalls or negativity around the census. So today's show is really about exploring the journey, what the census is there for, and we'll hear from our guest in his expert capacity, but also about why it is so important, dispelling some of those myths and moving forward and giving you an update as to where we are with the campaign and what the next steps are. So I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Dabinderjit Singh OBE, who's also a Director of the National Audit Office. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Well, if we start, obviously, this is a campaign that you've been active in for nearly 2 decades. I think it's important to understand actually what the census is about, how the census has changed in terms of its importance of the ethnicity category, linked to other legislation that's gone on. So could you sort of explain what that journey's been for ONS and how this has now become pivotal for life in the UK?
I think firstly, for lots of viewers sitting at home, they will know that a census happens every 10 years. Yeah. So in 2021, that's why this program's called Census 2021, that's when the next census will be, and it could be the last ever census. Yeah. So then we need to go back 10 years. So in 1991, it was the first time a question was raised around ethnicity. There was no question on religion. Mm-hmm. So in 1991, they introduced the census question on ethnicity, which was largely about colour of skin. Mm-hmm. It's about whether you're white, whether you're black, whether you're mixed, whether you're Asian, or whether you're something else. And then, under those sort of top-level categories, were often nationalities like Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, which really aren't ethnicities in the first place.
Yeah, and this is the key question, and because if you think about it, the census is always used for information purposes, for the government, not for definition of law or statutory legislation. It's purely for gathering and use of information, and needs for information change. So I suppose to understand its population and the diversity, that's why they were asking questions, and some of the inclusions around ethnicity were, as you say correctly, a mix of nationalities, skin colour, and maybe some race origins as well. So it's always been a mixed bag, and it continues to be so.
So basically in 1991, it's probably fair to say not many Sikhs were that bothered about that particular question. And the reason is there were no laws. We'll talk about the Race Relations Act of 1976 later on, but there were no real laws that meant that particular question in census really meant anything. Mm-hmm. It was a way the government were dividing people and monitoring, how many people, and that's largely what the census is. It's about how many. Then what you had was a big change. So in the year 2000, so before the 2001 census, you had the Race Relations Amendment Act of 2000. So I've talked about the Race Relations Act of 1976. That was all about discrimination. And
Discrimination on the basis of race.
that's right, on the basis of race. And Sikhs were covered by the 1976 Act, and we'll talk about the Mandla versus Lee case. And therefore, when the Race Relations Amendment Act came in, it actually reversed the discrimination issue to saying there will now be a positive duty on 40,000 public bodies, so there's about 20,000 schools, hospitals, local authorities, police forces, central government bodies, about 40,000 in total, that they would, following the Race Relations Amendment Act of 2000, have to monitor how they were providing services to ethnic groups.
So that became effectively legislation in the amendment that all, as you said, 40,000 public bodies were now legally obliged to record and monitor the ethnic makeup of people using its services.
So let's make it really simple. Take a school.
Yeah.
If a school has so many black people, so many Bangladeshis, so many Indian people, Pakistani people, they have to keep data on that. And then they also have to, the positive duty is about making sure that those children at that school belong to that particular group aren't treated any differently, they're treated fairly.
And their needs are addressed
So
accordingly.
it's a huge thing that every single person gets affected by this. And it is I would say, a huge advantage, therefore, to be classed as an ethnic group in the census.
And when we talk about public bodies, we talked about schools, but also they include the National Health Service. So all the health, daycare, all the sort of social care, healthcare institutes. It also covers policing in terms of how crimes are reported, how they were captured, how police services are then sort of utilised for the community. It also covers welfare and local government. In terms of
local government, central, any public service that you experience, from picking up
life,
rubbish,
pretty much every aspect of life living in this country, and everybody was then legally obliged to capture bases and monitor and report against its services on those ethnic communities.
And you mentioned the British Sikh Federation, and Kashmir Singh in particular, who was raising this issue about following the 91 census, as the 2001 census was coming up, that actually Sikhs are an ethnic group, and therefore why aren't they in the census categories? And what the Race Relations Amendment Act of 2000 did, because it was actually too late to change the 2001 census, because it takes about 3 years.
And this is something we'll come on to,
is we then launched a process whereby we could try and influence people that made decisions about what gets monitored. So in 2002, Gurbakh Singh, who was actually the chief executive of what was called the Community Relations Council, the CRE, I think it's called, just happened to be a Sikh. And we had a meeting with him, and we said, look, Sikhs are legally recognised as an ethnic group. And he said, yep, fully agree with you. And they had full responsibility, the CRE, for race issues and ethnic issues. And they changed their guidance in 2002 to say, whilst these 40,000 public bodies monitor the categories in the census, they added in, and given a specific example of Sikhs should also be monitored because they are an ethnic group in law.
So this is the CRE recognising that the legal change came in too late for the census. And we know this because we're talking to the ONS now, and we've been talking since 2014 for the census of 2021, but the decision will be made this year, so therefore 2 years before it's out. Too late to change the census. However, the CRE, who was then the leading body for race, acknowledged the recognition of Sikhs as an ethnic race, both legally and from the community, from the work that was done. And we saw articles in the Eastern Eye, and Balwinder Kaur Sahni was also part of those campaigns, and agreed to then put an additional guidance note out to say all of those 40,000 bodies, yes, use those categories, but also monitor Sikhs.
from a legal perspective.
So what changed?
So what then happened is the ONS, the Office for National Statistics,
Who actually
we've
do
been
the census, yeah?
talking to for many years now, in 2003, they put out guidance which says only use the categories in the census. So despite having changed the right person's mind in government, they a year later said to those 40,000 public, only use what's in the census.
This is quite important, especially for our viewers, because this is important steps of our history, that where we've got to is that Sikhs have been recognised as an ethnic race in law, and we'll come on to the case specifically, but government bodies and representatives have appreciated that fact and agreed with the community that actually, although where the census has limitations, and it's not about defining ethnicity per se, it is about how the construct of the census is built up and how it's used. And we've already talked about how widespread it was and how then it became legally binding. But we then talked about the recognition to have Sikhs monitored separately. But that being overturned by the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, who are responsible for the census. And when their guidance, this is the body that are independent of government, who pulled the census together, put all the data and analysis together in their own guidance, they were very clear and very specific that you should only use the census categories. So therefore, removing that duty or obligation that was put forward by the CRE to use Sikhs. So therefore, again, further discriminating that any recording of Sikhs would then also now not be available or relevant.
So what you then had in that period from 2001 to 2011 is we had a success with the CRE, we had the guidance change, but ONS effectively overruled that a year later. And what you then had is more and more people therefore became aware of the importance of this because of those 40,000 public bodies.
Legal ban,
And if I try and summarise what happened between 2003, because that's when Sikh Federation UK came into being, that's when we started lobbying. Politicians then started to realise.
And this was part of the Sikh agenda.
That's right. So the Sikh agenda was published in September 2001. And in 2002, the Conservatives were in opposition. And their shadow Home Affairs team was led by Oliver Letwin, Shadow Home Secretary, Dominic Grieve, and someone called David Cameron.
Who later went on to be Prime Minister.
Prime Minister. And in July 2002, so in that period, when they knew we were successful with the CRE, David Cameron hosted a lobby in Parliament in Portcullis House, and Oliver Letwin led a group of Sikhs to 10 Downing Street to deliver a petition specifically asking for Sikhs to be monitored by these 40,000 public bodies.
So at that time, with all the opposition, with the support by the Conservative opposition and all the publicity, was there opposition at that time?
I don't think there was opposition to the idea that Sikhs deserved to be treated fairly. And I don't think anyone raised their voice within the community or outside the community. But what you also had is Dominic Grieve tabled an early day motion, and it got the signatures of 174 MPs, including Theresa May, including David Cameron. And actually, it wasn't just Conservatives. There were Labour politicians, Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, they were all there. And in those days, 174 MPs in 2002 was a massive...
Well, even now, I mean, the record has recently been broken at 260 for the, again, Sikh related for the Sikh monument at Dhanmanjit Singh Desi table. But again, so to put on record that an early day motion, which is still available, it's on the records today, bears the signatures of over 170 MPs, including the current Prime Minister,
and the
former Prime Minister, and many other MPs, all who would have researched the issue, heard all the stories, and publicly put their name to it, that they're backing this.
And so what you then had is, if I fast forward to 2011, is as we were approaching the census, we realised that the ONS weren't budging on this. So in 2010, we produced a report. Gurneet Kaur, who's also a member of the Sikh Network, produced a report which set out in detail why Sikhs deserve to have an ethnic tick box. And on the back of that, we took out a pre-action letter. so for judicial review, which Bindmans and Co., one of the leading human rights lawyers that fought the Mandela versus Lee case, which we are going to talk about, they then did a pre-action letter, the government responded, and in the response they acknowledged, actually, legally speaking, we had the arguments. However, it was virtually impossible to stop the census, because remember, 3 years earlier is when the process starts. So,
and again, it's important to say, because we've gone through this time again, in that people often forget or don't fully appreciate that when you engage with these bodies, as we have done since 2014 from the Sikh network, there's an impression that has been given, and a very clear impression was set out by the ONS this year about looking at the Sikh category, and I suspect, and you'll know more, that that's probably been the case before, and that yes, there was a lot of noise, a lot of political pressure. So kind of we're replicating where we were in 2011, that we had a lot of community pressure. It was so obvious, given the legislation for Mandela versus Lee, that this should be a no-brainer. Politically, it had the support, but ONS sort of again dragged their feet, and at the last minute reversed the decision or went a different way, and that therefore killed the time for the community to respond.
The difference last time round compared to this time is when they did their consultation, the Sikh Federation got 100, and I think it's about 160 different Gurdwaras and organisations to all put in submissions in the consultation. And there were 3 or 4, one was by Age Concern Leicester, not even a Sikh body, that said we don't need a Sikh ethnic tick box. So there were 3 or 4 that were in opposition. And when they produced their summary report of the consultations, they said, we're regarding all these ones that they knew we'd organised as one response.
So
because they were very similar.
Fudging the results to suit their agenda.
And the reason we say that is because this time round, we asked them that question, do you want us to get every Gurdwara? Do you want to get every organisation? Or are you going to say...
Pull them all up as to one Sikh
we
group.
won. And this time around, they said, you just do the one. Sikh Federation, Sikh Network do one submission, and we regard it as from the Sikh community. But going back to that, there was last time around these 3 or 4 submissions in the official consultation which did oppose it. That's fine. That's on record, and it was there. However, Glenn Watson, who was the director for the census at ONS, we met him in Southampton, where their offices are, Amrik Singh, Gurneet and myself. And within a few weeks, he was challenged at a select committee by a Labour MP, who's still a Labour MP, Andy Slaughter from Hammersmith, who said, I've got a really useful briefing here. The Sikhs and Jews have come up with this other way, because they argued they couldn't give a Sikh box because there was a lack of
space,
paper.
And space on the
and
paper.
Spacer. And we came up with a solution which actually meant if you were a Sikh or a Jew, because you are recognised as an ethnic group under law, if you took that, you could actually save space, because then you're answering the religious question and the ethnic question in one go. And he was clearly, you could see this, we had it on video, he didn't know how to respond to that. So the pressure was there. But let's move forward, because I think it's already
I think we've touched a lot about Mandela versus Lee,
Yeah.
and I think it's useful to just sort of cover that, because a lot of the conversations that have gone on basically circle around the legislation. We live in this country by the highest court of the land in this country. The House of Lords unanimously decided in 1983 in Mandela versus Dao Lee, which was the case about Gurinder Singh Mandela going to school with his dastard on, and the late Seva Singh Mandela, who was his father, who challenged the case, was a very staunch supporter of the Sikh ethnic tick box, and actually recorded many videos which are on the Sikh network Facebook in 2011 of how Sikhs should protest against it by ticking other and manually putting Sikh in. And that was 20% of the then Sikh population did that as a protest. That's not a minority, that's a huge number that did a protest with very little communication. There was no televisions then, there was no social media. So this was a campaign that resonated with individuals because they knew the importance. And 20% to do a protest is unprecedented. It doesn't mean 80% were against it. They just either weren't aware of the protest or weren't aware of how to do it and how to register it, and had done what they'd always done. So Mandela versus Dao Lee, I mean, there were, for me, and I'll take your views, but the key things that came out of that judgment, and other commentators less closer to the case have taken it in different directions. But the key thing for I think for I take away is that the most highest law lords, judges in this country looked at Sikhi in its entirety.
Yep.
They went back to the history, and on 4 points that they decided that Sikhs met the criteria of both an ethnic race and a religion. And those were our sovereignty and our history, that we had a long dated specific history and we were a sovereign community and nation. They looked at the fact that we'd had our nationhood. We had Sikhs who ruled in the Punjab for many years, and it was a Sikh state, so it classified that. We had our unique language, spoken and written, which was specific to Sikhs. And we had a very rich culture, which was, again, very specific to Sikhs. And looking at all those factors, they decided that, based on that criteria, that Sikhs were an ethnic race. And we've always called ourselves a Qaum, a nation. The Sikh Panth, the Khalsa Panth, Guru Nanak talked about Nirmal Panth Chalaya, Guru Gobind Singh initiated the Khalsa Panth. And the definition of Panth is the collective of a nation and a community. And I think it's really important that everyone sort of looks at that. And I think that is non-Sikhs looking at Sikhi in its entirety over 500 years and coming up to that conclusion unanimously. There was no disagreement with that. And what was your sort of...
to keep this really simple for KT viewers, the Mandla versus Lee case was 35 years ago. In 1983, 5 law lords, the highest judges of this country, unanimously, 5-0, looked at the evidence. The Sikh history cannot change. Our scriptures cannot change. Our religion cannot change. Our culture can't change. The Sikhi way of life, the whole concept of the Panchakakar and what our gurus taught us can never change. Can never change. It doesn't matter where we're born. Some people just do not understand. They're arguing 35 years later, because most Sikhs are born in this country, those things have changed. They just cannot change. And those law lords, they weren't average people taken off the street. These were people that studied and gave a written judgment. And let me just repeat, Siva Singh Mandla, who's not with us today, he was very clear. He fought that case. That case took 5 or 6 years. There were demonstrations in London. You can now still get those photos of Niskam Sevak Jatha led that campaign. The late Harjit Singh, barrister, he fought that case. Talk to his son, who's a human rights lawyer now. They know that the rights that Sikhs won in 1983 are just as valid today as they were then, and will be in the future.
I mean, it really was a landmark case, and having spoken to both Siva Singh Mandla at length and his son Gurinder recently about this, they're huge supporters of the campaign, as is the Nishkam Seva Jathu, who also supported the campaign from the start and also supported via their declaration. Both of them were adamant that this was pivotal for Sikhs in protection of the Sikh identity. Actually much bigger than just a census category. Census category is just the legal requirement. Actually, and this is where I think 2 points you've made are really key to pick on. One is that it is about Sikh tick box, not a personal tick box for me, where am I along my journey? Well, I don't do that, and I'm not Sheikh, and I'm this. Well, actually, this is not about, it's not about how we define individuals' opinions, it's about the faith itself, and it's about the Qaum itself, and those things are constant. And the second thing is that actually this is much bigger, in that this is about our identity, our being, and looking at all of our contributions and sacrifices that have gone on since the inception of Sikhi for this identity. This was another milestone, landmark case in protecting that identity, as was the Helmets case. And we seem to be eroding all of that hard work without understanding, from a religious perspective, what we are, as a nation, what we stand for, sovereignty, and also from a legislation point of view. Before we move on for a break, tell us again specifically how that case has helped and why the recognition of an ethnic race, and who else was this applied to? What did that change for Sikhs and
So,
sort of the laws?
so very
going forward?
briefly, what happened is when that case was on 1983, it was a landmark case. And even now, you can talk to politicians, you can talk to different faith communities, and they will say that one case, the Manda versus Lee case, gave Sikhs greater rights than any other faith other than the Jewish faith. So Sikhs and Jews are covered by the decision in Manda versus Lee. But whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're a Hindu, any other faith, you are not regarded, legally speaking, as a separate race with reference to ethnic origins.
Yeah.
That's the crux of the matter.
It's important to mention that actually that's by this country only.
Yeah.
And actually that is based on the criteria that they looked at. And if you look at how the Jewish community, they've accepted that. They use it, they have a different set of challenges and issues to the Sikh community. We are very distinct, our identity is very distinct. But also I guess it's about that with that case, that this is now given this country that recognition of Sikhs because of where we came from, what we had to endure in this country. But it doesn't apply anywhere else, and it actually doesn't apply to any other countries in terms of whether we are or not, or I guess other religions, they would have to satisfy the criteria. It's not like they've been excluded. They just didn't, A, they didn't have the need to, and B, they weren't considered against that criteria.
But you remember when Jagmeet Singh was here,
Yeah.
and he said, I've studied the laws in every country. And that time we didn't have any Sikh MPs. He said, I'd rather be a Sikh here because of the rights you've won.
But the
because the law in this country and the Manda versus Lee case gave us rights that Sikhs haven't got anywhere else in the world.
Oh, and I say we won those rights through
Yeah.
huge sacrifice campaigns. We're going to continue the conversation. We're going to take a short break. Stay tuned to KTV, Sky 770, and we'll now move on to, in the second part of the show, talk about why is the census so important, how it will be used for Sikhs, and what the latest is on the campaign up until the present day. And so please join us in a few minutes on the show. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.